Hello, world history. This video is for those of you who are doing your editorial on nuclear war, the possibility of it, and we're using the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're gonna look at the causes of it, the course of it, and the effects. We're gonna look at the lessons learned of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you're going to apply it to our current nuclear situation when you write your editorial. And so this is where you're gonna put it. It's on this Google Doc that looks like this. It says editorial. And in the beginning, first you're going to research the historic event, that's today. Then you're going to briefly research a current event on Tuesday. And then finally on Wednesday, you're going to connect your thoughts about how the event should guide our thinking about our present problem. And that you're not going to solve our current problem, but you're going to provide insight and reasoning that's through this historic example to help people think about the right way to approach, in this case, our topic. I'd like you to write, it's nuclear war. So write nuclear war right there. And the historic example right here, I'd like you to write Cuban Missile Crisis. So the topic is nuclear war. And the historic example we're going to look at is the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay. So you have that written there, that written there. We're going to look at the cause, the course, the effects, and lessons learned, okay? And you've already looked at the video. It's a great TED Talk video about the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's a good little video. Check it out, and you've taken notes on that. And here's also in the book that goes from Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. That's on page 984. And then on 985, that has information about Cuba. And you can see this book is not updated. Castro died in 2016. I think this book was written in 2014. Anyway, here are my notes. And I'll take a picture of my notes and explain them too. I'll explain them right now. But anyway, here it is in the middle, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is the course of the event. The effects are over here. The causes are here. Lessons learned and a background. Now, this is just the notes that I took. You can always, have different ones. But so the Cuban Missile Crisis, what was it? In 1962, in the video there, it said 6 days, but when I've studied it, it's typically 13 days, where the U.S. is at the brink of nuclear war, the edge of war. And why is it? Well, you have to sort of go back to see what is causing a nuclear war to almost break out. Where Soviets claimed that the U.S. made an act of war, ships were going to Cuba, the United States spy plane, the U-2, was shot down over Cuba. The Soviet submarine was hit by a depth charge and almost launched a nuclear missile. Finally, there was a diplomatic agreement reached. Why did we almost come to the edge of war? Well, a lot of it has to do with Cuba. And the U.S., if we go to the background, the U.S. were imperialists in Cuba from 1898. That's the Spanish-American War, when the United States defeated Spain and took a lot of our imperialist territories from the Philippines to Guam to Puerto Rico to Cuba. And there was a revolution against, just like imperialists everywhere, the United States had dominated Cuba economically, politically, and culturally. We had a dictator set up, and our companies were making money at the expense of the Cuban people. And so there was a communist revolution that overthrew the old dictator Batista, and kicked out all the U.S. companies, nationalized all the industry. And so the U.S., after 1959, instead of Cuba being dominated by the U.S., they had revolted against the U.S. and become independent. And so we tried to get Cuba back, and we launched a failed invasion at the Bay of Pigs in 1961. And then after we launched that invasion, because Cuba is only, it's very close off the Florida coast. It's like 60 miles off the coast. Then Cuba sought Soviet aid. And so I went to the Soviets. Now, when the Soviets saw this as an opportunity, and so the Soviets put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The U.S. had surrounded the Soviet Union with missiles in Turkey and in parts of Europe pointed right at the USSR. And so the Soviets saw this as a great opportunity to to put their nukes in Cuba. And so they did, and our spy planes took photographs showing those nukes there. And so our president was John F. Kennedy, and he had a choice. Should he invade Cuba with the U.S. Army and Navy and Marines and take out those nukes and overthrow Castro's government? He chose not to do that, even though a lot of people were telling him to do that. He didn't want to risk nuclear war. He decided to create a blockade around the island. He called it a quarantine because a blockade would be an act of war. He made up another name. We all know what quarantine is. He wanted to social distance the Russians from Cuba instead of have an invasion. And so when he blocked Cuba, here's little Cuba, and then down here there's the United States, there's Florida. Here's Cuba. And so the Russian ships are coming. They're not sailing ships, but here they're coming. And then the U.S. has a blockade. These little dots are U.S. warships surrounding Cuba so that the Soviets can't bring more missiles in. Okay? And so these ships get right up close to our ships. They're submarines. There are airplanes. And one little mistake can end up triggering a massive nuclear retaliation. Remember, the U.S. has our missiles pointed, and if one thing goes wrong, and lots of things went wrong, luckily there was no nuclear war. The Soviets did not send all of their missiles and bombers, and we did not do that either. And a lot of that had to do with President Kennedy's leadership and his striving for peace and reaching a diplomatic agreement rather than through violence. And so some of the effects of being able to reach this diplomatic agreement, they made a deal. The Soviets withdrew their missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. promised not to invade Cuba. So the U.S. no longer would have this nuclear threat from Cuba, but the Soviets and the Cubans get a promise that the U.S. would not invade. The U.S. has had an embargo on Cuba that continues to this day, where we don't trade with them. And so still, you could consider that an act of war on Cuba, but not actual, that's economic war, but not actual war. The U.S. removed our Jupiter missiles from Turkey when the Soviets withdrew their missiles. And then Khrushchev was not popular in the USSR because of this decision. He ends up getting ousted and replaced by a more hardline, militaristic leader named Brezhnev. Kennedy, of course, the next year he was assassinated, and there are all sorts of conspiracy theories, but only conspiracy theories that relate somehow either the Bay of Pigs or the Cuban Missile Crisis to his being assassinated, but there is no historical proof for it. The most important effect of the Cuban Missile Crisis was something that you can't see. It was the fact that there was no nuclear war, that peace was achieved, and that is the outstanding effect of it. The other one, I forgot to say, is that there was a direct communication line. Remember, this is the times of phones. Direct communication between Moscow and Washington, D.C. Direct communication. And why is direct communication between two nuclear powers so important? Because if there's a misunderstanding, you can talk to the other side, and they can say, "Oh, please, we just made a horrible misunderstanding, and please don't go to nuclear war." This was a captain of a ship made an impulsive decision or something like that. We need to stand down. And so what are some of the lessons that we've learned from the Cuban Missile Crisis back in 1962? Well, peace is fragile, especially when you have nuclear missiles and nuclear weapons controlled by people that can destroy humanity. Diplomacy, the art of being able to talk and find solutions rather than use force, is incredibly important, because a small crisis can quickly escalate into a large one. Whereas, something happening on one island in Cuba, one island in the Caribbean could potentially have sparked a nuclear war. And so this is why the President of the United States must be a disciplined person who's intelligent and strong, who can not make impulsive decisions or destabilize the world because of the immense power that the president has to launch nuclear war, and that is within the president's capability. And so, even though we have these weapons, and many countries do now, peace. The fact that we haven't had war, a lot of that is because of the discipline and of the of our presidents who have tried to avoid war at all costs. And the Cuban Missile Crisis shows that while we're able to go to the brink of war, as we need to be thinking about peace above all things when due to these the extreme violent technology that can that creates an existential threat to our world. Okay, I'll upload these notes if you want to take a look at it, and you'll end up putting them in your editorial, in your notes. What's the historical example? Cuban Missile Crisis. Define it. What was the cause? What's the course of it? What goes on during it? What are the effects? And what are lessons learned? You can use ones that I gave you, and you can also use ones that you have decided. So was this a success or a failure that the U.S. government made? Why or why not? What do you think? It's up to you. Was the Cuban Missile Crisis a success for the U.S. government or a failure, and why? Okay. Thanks a lot. I hope this helped.